How's it going, everyone? I'm Kevin,
And I'm Jackson,
and this is A Disciple.
and a doubter.
So, today we are going to be continuing a little bit of our conversation from last week where we were talking about the story of Exodus and specifically analyzing Jordan Peterson's thoughts on the book of Exodus.
That's right. If you guys didn't get a chance to check out that episode, then I think we'd both recommend it. I thought it was one of our better episodes, and Peterson's always an interesting figure too.
To discuss because Peterson really talks about, like, to briefly summarize a little bit of what we talked about last time. Peterson talks of when he reads Bible stories such as the book of Exodus. A lot of people kind of read these stories as just like children's fairy tales, and that there's not really much deeper meaning that could be gleaned from these stories. But you could look at these stories in a very intellectual sense, in a way that helps you uncover deeper truths about humanity. And I think that's how most people read these stories for most of history until fairly recently, when the popular culture kind of adopted a very materialist, rationalist way of looking at things. When you really unpeel the layers that are contained in these ancient stories, there's a lot of wisdom to be found. So, one of the things that I thought was fascinating that Peterson talks about in the book of Exodus is his description of the pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire that guides the Israelites from Egypt to the promised land. Now, I think that's a fairly common image that a lot of people know, that as the Israelites were journeying in the desert, they had, like I said, the cloud and the fire guiding them. And Peterson kind of discusses how this cloud and fire represent God himself. But why would God manifest himself as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire? And it's kind of because God is, we understand God as Christians as this first principle of the cosmos. Essentially, like, what truth lies most deeply at the heart of existence itself. And when you look at a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, it kind of represents like darkness within light and also light within darkness. Like this interplay between order and chaos itself. Like what is known, the interplay between what is known and what is unknown, what is to be and what is yet to become. And that spirit itself, this perfect interplay between what is known and what is unknown, is the force that drives the Israelites from slavery to freedom, if that makes sense. And it kind of connects back into our discussion that we've had, that we were, it kind of ties back to what we were discussing last week, in that it's helpful to think of God as not just this sky daddy that you could just look up in the sky and see this big man with a white beard, but it's helpful to think of God more as the force, the fundamental force of existence that drives you forth to pursue what is most conducive to your flourishing. And what is most conducive to people's flourishing, probably in the most basic sense, is the journey from, is the wrestling with chaos and wrestling with what is unknown, essentially, and venturing out into the darkness to try to bring the light.
I think, yeah. This is sort of a point you made, but just to reiterate it, like the our sort of as you know rational, well-educated people, our instinct when we read these stories is to think like, oh, there was a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, right?
Yeah.
Pillar of clouds. It's like, oh, really? Like there was a pillar of fire and clouds? That's ridiculous. It's clearly a myth, and well, like maybe it is a myth, but this is to your point a few minutes ago. This is why Peterson is so uh, insightful, because he's like, okay, well, maybe it's a myth, but well, what is the deeper meaning to this myth? I mean, rather than just dismissing this story, which is thousands of years old and which is deeply embedded in our culture, because it doesn't make sense to us. Like, Peterson's like, can we go a little deeper here and figure out the true significance of pillar of fire and cloud? So Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
like.
it's really what's really interesting is that Richard Dawkins of all people, when studying animals and just biology in
Boo.
general, yeah, he mentioned that you could kind of tell an animal. You could basically map out an animal's environment just by examining the animal's biology. Like if you examine a porpoise, for instance, just first animal that came to my head, and you take a look at the genome and what traits this animal has adapted over time to help it survive, basically like studying why did this animal evolve in the way that it did, then you could, like I said, be able to map out all the features of this animal's environment so that you could determine why it adapted in the way that it did. And when it comes to human beings, it's funny because our brains are wired in such a way, as particularly the left hemisphere of the brain is wired in such a way that it's able to process experiences that are known to us versus experiences that are unknown. Like, because our brains, of course, need to be able to venture into unknown situations so that we could survive, essentially. But this, again, this interplay of known versus unknown is itself that's reflected in our physically in our biology is also the way that God chooses to manifest himself to the Israelites as he guides them from slavery to freedom. And what's fascinating about that to me is that it's like even if you look at this from like a bottom up materialist perspective, just analyzing our brains, there's something about our physiology that demonstrates that we're really meant to pursue like higher ordered things. And when I say higher ordered things, I mean like why would our brains evolve in such a way that we're called to well, like why would our brains evolve in such a way that we're called to find the proper interplay between order and chaos if there wasn't first if there wasn't already this transcendent interplay between order and chaos that existed prior to our material brains developing.
How do you think, if you don't mind my interrupting, how do
Go
you
ahead.
think how would the atheist explain that? Because obviously the religious explanation is that there is that sort of transcendent interplay between known and unknown, order and chaos, uh, which is then why we too are a part of that interplay. But like the atheist clearly doesn't believe in that transcendent thing. So I mean, how in your best guess, how would the atheist go about explaining that? Because I think we should maybe give the other
Yeah,
side at least some say here.
I think I think the atheist would say that striking the proper balance between the known and unknown is something that's meant purely for just our physical survival. In that, in order to survive, you obviously have to be willing to be courageous and you have to face
Right.
the chaos of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a willingness to do that, especially given what you've adapted from the past, then that you would become more evolutionarily fit and you'd be able to survive and reproduce and I guess ultimately just propagate your species as
Mm-hmm.
an end in and of itself.
Yeah.
But and this is kind of jumping the gun a little bit to what I want to discuss about what I want to discuss later.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the really fascinating question to me and the reason why I'm personally convinced that meaning comes before matter as opposed to matter coming before meaning. That was an odd way to phrase that, but I guess what I'm trying to say is the reason I'm convinced that there
That
is
you're not
meaning,
that existentialism is wrong.
yes, is is because like I think why would our brains evolve in such a way if we really were just purely material
Mm-hmm.
and all ends in death, then why would our brains even bother adapting in this way at all. Like why would we be wired in such a way that we seek freedom from tyranny if we were just going to die and that would just be the end of it and our children would die and our grandchildren would die and everything around us would simply just die. And like that's really what's fascinating to me. And I think it even ties back into when you look at the in the story of Exodus when like most people have probably heard the term manna or like the bread from heaven, like the spiritual, the thing that sustains the spirits of the Israelites. Like I think people probably interpret what that represents in different ways, but the bread from heaven most likely was not like physical bread falling from the sky. It was probably more of a like spiritual sustenance that enabled the Israelites to keep driving forward, eyes facing heavenward, so that they could achieve true freedom. And but how could true freedom exist? I guess that's the question I want to pose is like how could true freedom exist if death truly is just the end? And this actually reminds me of sorry, before you respond to that, this actually
Yeah,
reminds
go
me
ahead.
of one of the coolest quotes I've ever heard was from Peterson, where he says, "It's best to aim up and tell the truth than to cooperate productively and generously. Planning requires an outcome rather than the higher faith that love and honest conduct will bring about what's best, regardless of evident consequence." And I think basically what that quote is saying is that it's best to act in a way that's morally righteous always, in such a way that like you act righteously for its own sake regardless of the specific outcomes because of the fact that you can't control the outcomes and ultimately all things worldly end in death. So there has to be some sort of intrinsically valuable quality to acting righteously for reasons that just transcend mere evolutionary survival.
I think I got a little bit lost on the argument there, but one thing that I do want to say is that um I think I think you do a really good job in pointing out that there there's this part of us which in a rather strange way strives for higher order good, strives to be courageous, strives to be moral, strives to love thy neighbor as thyself. And we've been very aware of this fact of our nature for uh, a long time now. And it seems like for most of human history, we we took that fact of our nature that we are all uh, inclined towards something higher to be evidence of God or of a transcendent spiritual realm. Um, and but it seems like very recently with the development of science and everything that's come with that, we we overlook the immense mystery that is our desire for God, our desire for virtue, because we think that it can all be explained by observing processes in the material world. Um,
But I guess what's really interesting is that even when you think about like the smallest dust, like this the smallest particle imaginable, like
mhm.
we could describe scientifically various properties of this particle, but at the end of the day, like what it truly is on like its deepest possible essence, like how it came about
Right.
and what constitutes like this speck of dust. Let's even say I think the smallest particle scientifically is called like like a
Planck or Planck?
Planck something,
Planck?
like quantum Planck something. But it's just
We're not
imagine like
physicists,
the
guys.
most.
We
No, we're
are
not. But
aspiring
just
theologians, kind of.
yeah. But it's just like imagine the most basic, the smallest possible thing that makes up atoms, makes up subatomic particles. Like I said, the most fundamental building block. On a deep level, we don't really know anything about those.
Mhm.
And like there could be a scientist who could tell you like certain physical properties maybe of these particles, but like what truly constitutes them and their nature and their very essence, like where did they come from?
Right.
What is their purpose in a cosmic sense? That is basically just as ineffable as God himself.
Another interesting way of thinking about that is in reference to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? So in theory we could explain this is kind of what you're saying. We could explain everything in the material world. We can explain everything that happens on Earth. We can explain everything that happens in the Milky Way, everything that happens in the whole of the universe, in theory, one day
Mm-hmm.
when science progresses far enough. And it's like, okay, cool. But the one thing that we won't be able to explain is why any of that exists at all. Like there's some kind of this is what you're getting at. There's some kind of uh what would you call it? Ground of being, a force which allows everything as we know it to exist, that is beyond science, beyond rationality.
And it's even like and even connecting that biblically too. Like in a like there's a scene in one of these early books. It's either Exodus or Numbers, I think, where Moses is like Moses looks upon God, but he could only see God's back,
Yeah,
kind of representing just the incomprehensibility of God's nature.
right.
And like I said, like even you said, like the why,
Uh-huh.
as simple as a tiny speck of dust may seem, the why of like why does this dust exist as it does? Like where did it come from? And I'm not even talking about on like a material level. I'm talking about on more of like a metaphysical level. And I don't think that's something science could answer. And when you look at like rationalist and kind of like when we were saying like when the world was created, like I think it's like one of the very first lines in the entire Bible
Hmm.
and one of the most famous lines too is let there be light. And that's
Right.
kind of connecting back to that pillar of cloud, pillar of light notion that I was discussing, that like the first principle itself is kind of this interplay between order and chaos, as in what is known and what is unknown. Like God himself speaks forth into the darkness of chaos essentially and instigates order. That is the very first principle of existence, is is again like that interplay between the known and the unknown. I know I keep throwing that phrase out there,
Yeah.
but it's even kind of reflected in the it's even reflected in the Far East. Like you imagine like the Taoist yin yang symbol,
Hmm.
that this is the force which that like this striking the proper balance, as you could imagine. Like everyone knows the yin yang kind of looks like that with the black
Looks
and the white.
exactly like that.
Yeah.
Perfect representation.
And yeah, for those of you that are just listening, I just made a symbol with my hands to try to represent the yin yang. Anyway, but it's like if you think about that as the first principle, if God is that interplay, that cosmic dance, then and then you also look at stories like Exodus, where you think of in Egypt, that was clearly an excess of, I shouldn't say clearly, but in for those of you who are less familiar with the story, in Egypt, obviously the Israelites were slaves for like 400 years, and they were created for a different purpose, but then to be slaves. They were created to ultimately worship God, but because they were oppressed by this tyrannical order which had manifested itself through the Pharaoh and all his wicked machinations. And in seeking freedom, they necessarily had to face the desert of chaos itself. Like they had to venture into the unknown, and in a way kind of speak light into darkness, and or in a way they had to enter into this period of darkness and try to seek the light. And the fact that that story is so true to in all of our lives, like the fact that that story is just such a common feature of humanity, meaning like the necessity of the necessity of escaping slavery into the necessity of escaping slavery so that we could live out what we're truly called for. And the fact that to do so often means that we must willingly enter into this place of chaos and try our best to make order. I think that just reflects, that validates the book of Genesis, in which the first principle is God Himself speaking order into chaos.
Hmm.
If any of that made sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have a point and then I suppose a question.
Yeah,
I like how you mentioned the I don't know what book it's in either, but when Moses perceives God, but he only conceives back, and
yeah,
like this is what we've been talking about. So you read that, and your first instinct is, oh, like what? Really, Moses saw God's back? What does that even mean? That's just a ridiculous tale. But as you pointed out, the sort of what that is getting at is that God is this inconceivable, ineffable thing, and that if we can grasp him, we can only grasp him in very small and insufficient ways. And so we see then that these early peoples who were compiling these texts thousands and thousands of years ago understood this really kind of profound philosophical idea that uh, like there must be a ground of being, there must be a first cause or an unmoved mover, as Aquinas says, and they expressed it in this very literary way because that's how ideas were conveyed back then. And now we, as modern people who convey ideas differently, read these stories and think they're total garbage, uh,
but
totally missing
it's
the fact
so it's so interesting that like you could reflect so much greater truth, oftentimes just through art and storytelling, than you can through just like writing out a strict like philosophical essay, for instance.
that,
Like it
right?
makes me think like, could you think of a philosopher like Friedrich Nietzsche,
Mm.
who, or think of an author like Dostoevsky. I think two guys who we actually mentioned, I think, on our last episode.
We definitely talked
But
about Dostoevsky.
yeah, these guys, just think like Nietzsche. If you sat him down and said like, hey, if you sat these two guys down and kind of just said like, hey, tell me about humanity, or like write an essay just about deep truths of humanity,
Hmm.
and don't make it literary. Just write your straight thoughts.
Right.
Nietzsche would probably do a better job in
Really.
that type of
Nietzsche's
setting.
actually a very
But
literary philosopher. He's like the most literary philosopher ever.
is
But
he?
it's a
I
good
actually
point.
didn't know that.
It's a good, but
But
he's more he still
yeah,
formulates his ideas in more propositional form than Dostoevsky does. But he
I
is
was
pretty
gonna
literary.
I was gonna say though, like if you just say write deep truths about humanity, Nietzsche would
Uh,
probably be able to do a better job at expressing it directly.
yeah, yeah,
But that's not to say Dostoevsky arguably reflects just intuitively through his literature and like
mhm,
storytelling, reflects possibly deeper truths about humanity than anything Nietzsche would be able to just say in a very strict, direct sense.
you
My
know what's
point being is that
hilarious?
like art reflects truths indirectly in ways that like the artist can't even state off the top of his head, because they're just things that are written into his heart that he's able to express only
Yeah.
through his artistic medium. What's
Um.
hilarious?
Yeah. So it's funny that we're talking about Peterson in this episode. So Peterson is very influenced both by Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and
Yeah, that's
I've
why I brought
actually
up those two.
I've heard him say at one point, uh,
I'm
Dostoevsky
pretty.
is more profound than Nietzsche because
Yeah, that's why.
he writes fiction and
That's
Nietzsche
why I use
writes
those two, because
philosophy.
those are the two guys that Peterson talks about.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But it's yeah. So it really makes me think. Like, I guess really the question we should be asking is if it's the case that there is this very incomprehensible, ineffable force that guides from slavery to freedom and compels us to seek the proper balance between order and chaos in our lives. And if this force is even reflected into our physiology, like if it's true that we reflect, as Dr. Dawkins said, that creatures reflect their environments, and if it's true that we reflect God in this sense, is it fair to view God as a personality? Or should we just view God as this like impersonable, if that's a word, maybe in
Non-person.
a non-person force?
Yeah.
And I would argue, yes, it's
Non-person.
necessary
Yeah.
that we view God as a personality for the following reasons.
See, yeah. Well, sorry, I'll let you go ahead. But I think this is a really fascinating argument to me. I think I know what you're going to say, and I really find this compelling. But anyway,
Okay,
enlighten our audience.
here's how I'm going to try to best explain this. I would say that if we understand God, like I said, as the force which compels us, as the most fundamental truth itself, and as the force which compels us to seek the highest possible good, then I think it's very clear that I think it's very clear that in making choices that are most conducive to a transcendent form of flourishing in our lives, it's necessary that we sacrifice part of ourselves for the good of other people. And I guess I would say that it is, by that I mean that in living, this is a really difficult idea that I'm trying to express right now.
I think, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong in the direction that you're trying to take this, but I think that this might be a simpler formulation of the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're kind of getting at is that we're all that we have this drive towards a higher thing, towards a transcendent thing, and we might call that drive morality. Let just to make this simple.
Sure, sure.
We yeah, we all have an inner voice, a conscience, which seems to tell us what is right and what is wrong, and we'll call that morality. Uh, and so, well then, so if you believe that this morality is an objective fact about the universe and not just something that's subjective to each individual, um, well then there must be something which grounds uh, this objective morality, and we would, as we've been pointing out, the thing which would ground that objective morality would be the ground of all being, which we have defined as God. Uh, and so then I think the argument goes, uh, well, morality necessarily only applies to persons. It's kind of absurd to think of a
I think that's basically what I was trying to get
yeah,
at.
yeah. So maybe you take it from here then. Like,
Yeah,
yeah, the sort of the
morality
force which
does just
grounds all
apply to
morality would have to
persons
be personal because morality only applies to persons, that being
because
ourselves.
morality necessarily involves sacrifice, I would argue. And here's what I wrote down. I wrote that the fundamental logos, aka the most basic principle of the universe, which we call God, the fundamental logos driving us upward has a personality. We can negotiate with it and make sacrifices for its own sake, like how we make sacrifices for those we love. Like if we live our lives as persons who are future oriented, meaning we don't just live for the immediate pleasure of the moment, and higher and ultimately higher oriented, meaning we don't just seek pure material things that will eventually die. If we negotiate with this logos in that sense, then it's in a similar way to how we negotiate with the people we love and how we make communal sacrifices for those around us. So we relate to this first principle exactly like how we relate to our fellow neighbor. So even when examining the golden rule, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, body, and strength. And following that is love your neighbor as yourself. So I think like in
Mm.
choosing to love the Lord your God with every fiber of your being, that essentially means you're called to find the proper balance in your life between order and chaos in a sense. Meaning like you're called to properly strive forward, eyes face heavenward, towards what is most highest, towards what is most conducive to the good of humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
And if you if you make if you dedicate your entire life to sacrificing for this first principle, then it will necessarily follow as a consequence that you'll love your neighbor as yourself, because that is the what it means to seek what is highest, is to love your neighbor as yourself. So in loving your neighbor as yourself, you're loving God. But probably the right ordered way of thinking about that is in loving God, you will love your neighbor as yourself. So when we say God loves you, what we're really saying is that the ultimate spirit of goodness that defines the entire cosmos is calling us forth, guiding us, and giving us the strength to sacrifice properly. Essentially saying that God, as this ultimate force, is someone who, through his love that he has for you, is eternally calling you forth to make proper sacrifices because that is what is ultimately best for you.
I th- I think there's a question which now begs asking if you
Go ahead.
yeah. So I'm I'm thinking of the golden rule as it's typically formulated nowadays, and I think what people say that it is um, treat others as you want to be treated. So they, you know, modern secular culture totally discards the first part and then switches up the second part to be a little bit uh, less of a burden. Uh, and but so I think the the fact that we are inclined to throw away that first part, love the Lord your God. I think it's actually it's noteworthy because like I think for a lot of people it's pretty intuitive how you go about loving your neighbor as yourself or treating others as you want to be treated. I mean that most people know how to do that even if they don't successfully do it, and we all fall short from time to time, obviously. But I think for a lot of people, the idea of loving God, of you used a lot of fancy words and phrases to describe what it means to love God that I'm not going to be able to uh, uh, repeat sufficiently. But I guess, well, yeah, for me personally, it's it's pretty easy to see how I can uh, love you, Kevin Sadler, my uh, podcast co-host, as I love myself. Uh, no homo.
Mm.
But when I think about what does it mean to love God, what does it mean to orient my entire being towards the ground of all being, towards this somewhat abstract principle, that's a lot harder for me to conceive of. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think
You
this
know,
is
it
this is
is.
what trips a lot of people up, and why
Because God just
secular
seems
people
so
love the second part of
abstract.
the golden rule but not the first part.
but yeah, because God does seem, if we just think of God as a principle rather than a personality, then God does seem very abstract and hard to relate to, because how
Mhm.
could you really make loving sacrifices for just a principle? Kind of
But
like what you were
maybe,
saying earlier.
yeah.
Like morality kind of only exists if you have an interpersonal relationship.
I suppose the
And
Gospels have an answer for us here. This is
I
getting
suppose
interesting.
yeah, I suppose the gospel do have an answer for us in that fortunately God did make himself very apparent about 2000 years ago when he decided to join us in our material world through the incarnation, through the blessed Mother of God, and chose to be born as a human being, which is pretty cool. And Jesus himself even says, and this is kind of tying back to what we were talking about 15 minutes ago with this particular gospel story, where Jesus speaks to the woman at the well and says to her, for those of you who don't know this story, essentially this woman is at a well, she's just filling up water, and Jesus pretty much tells her, like, this water you drink will leave you thirsty again, but if you seek the living water which I provide, you will never thirst. That's not a direct quote, that's kind of just a paraphrase of his
I
message.
don't think we've ever successfully directly
No, I
quoted
don't think we have ever
but yeah.
successfully directly quoted something. But this what I think this quote is really getting at is, like I said, what we were talking about earlier, is that there is there is a living water that exists that is eternally satisfying, because everyone knows water, like this type of water that you just buy at a bottle at a store, or in the ancient times if you would go to the well
Mm,
to get it, then it's only going to leave you satisfied for a short period, and then in a couple hours you might be thirsty again, especially if you're doing hard labor or whatever.
mm,
But there is, and then eventually it's going to leave you permanently unsatisfied, in that no matter how much water you drink, you're still going to die.
right.
So, but there is a form of water which, even though you still die in an earthly sense,
Mm.
there's a form of water which sustains you eternally. And Jesus is essentially saying, I exist as this, like, I am the first principle of creation, and therefore I myself am the living water. Meaning, like, if you sacrifice for me, for my sake, out of love for me, then you will ultimately never die. Because this woman is, she's making sacrifice, like using, exercising her labor for the sake of this earthly water. Whereas, and of course, that's not bad. Like, we do, I'm not saying that we should all just never drink water again,
Mm.
because then we would die very soon. But ultimately, the number one aim in our lives, so the number one thing for which we exercise our labor, should be to receive the living water of Jesus himself, because Jesus is, like I said, the first principle of creation, that which is ever sustaining and will leave us eternally satisfied.
This reminds me of Jesus's response when he's tempted by Satan with uh, loaves in the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, "It is written, man shall not live on bread," and we can put in parentheses water uh, alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God.
And it's, yeah,
Which is to
it's,
say that materiality is important, but that it is not the end all be all. That there is something higher that we are all aware of, towards which we all strive.
and I think a lot of atheists listening to this
We might not have many, but
would say, yeah, we might not have many, but
I'll send it
a
to my
lot of
atheist friends.
atheists listening to this are really just going to them, I think we're probably explaining this in a way that this all just sounds kind of like a bunch of BS, or like
Well,
bunk,
man,
or
I don't
what are
know.
you guys
Maybe
talking about? But I don't know. I'm just trying to think though. The question I would pose to an eight, or one observation that I heard someone make online, which I fully agree with, is you could you're always willing to you could always be free in any circumstance as long as you're willing to be crucified. Meaning, like, if you're willing to undergo the most amount of suffering that a human person could experience, then you're free to essentially do whatever you want because there's no consequence which could ultimately bog you down. But then, in a sense, that seems kind of counterintuitive because you think, like, oh, well, then you're not really free, though, because if you get crucified, then you're just going to be dead. And
Hmm.
in what sense are you free? But then I think there is something like truly profound to like the thought of martyrdom, for instance. Like I'm thinking of Saint Maximilian Kolbe, where he was a priest who was in Auschwitz during World War II, and one prisoner escaped, and as a punishment, the Nazi soldiers lined up all of these prisoners and said, like, all right, like we're going to discourage future people from escaping. We're going to take 10 of you and just throw you into a bunker and just starve you to death. And
Hmm.
then the one man was chosen, the 10th man was chosen and is in some sense like begging for his life, saying like, no, like please, like I have a family and a wife. But then St. Maximilian Kolbe just stepped out of line and said like, oh no, like take me instead. And then they took St. Maximilian Kolbe instead. And then as he was in his bunker, just starving to death, like he just spent his time praying and just in, inspiring hope within the other men who were dying around him. And he died like probably not literally with a smile on his face, but there was from like all the stories that were told about him, like he died with joy in his heart. And it makes you think like if
Well,
you
that's
don't,
actually so profound. Sorry to cut you off, but like
yeah,
even if you don't have a smile on your face, even if you're not happy in the moment, then you can still very much have joy in your heart, and which is more important. Yeah,
yeah,
that's a really
but
profound idea.
if there is like if meaning doesn't come before matter, which to use a phrase that I used earlier on in this episode, I'm trying to think of a better way to phrase that. If it's true that
Well,
the
what the
meaning the
can
meaning
I
which shapes our
go ahead.
biology, I was just saying if it's true that the meaning which shapes our biology, like the reason why we have desires that we do, if it's true that those are purely just for our worldly survival and that they don't touch upon anything that transcends the world,
Hmm.
essentially saying if it's true that God isn't real, then why do we have an innate admiration for stories like that of Saint Maximilian Kolbe?
Right.
Like how could we possibly find joy in death if God isn't real? Or
Hmm.
like how could we find anything profound or beautiful if all just ends in death? That's my questions for atheists. Like how could you appreciate any semblance of truth, goodness, or beauty if it's all just going to end in death? I don't think you can. And I've never really heard a good response for how you possibly could. Like it's sorry, I actually just want to tell the story of this dream I had the other night. It was a fascinating dream where I was it was sometime in the future in this dream and I lived in a world that was just overtaken by anti-Christian extremists. And like so, they were so extremely anti-Christian that the rule was if you're Christian, we're going to kill you in a brutal way. Not really unlike many societies that have existed in the past or currently exist. Think of like the Roman Empire, for instance, where they would feed Christians to lions. But that form of society revamped itself, and it was now. And so I was hanging out with my family, and I remember my dad in my dream said like, "Yeah, if we're not going to give ourselves up." as in like we're not just going to go out into the open and say, "Hey, we're Christian, come get us." However, if they do find us, we're going to stick to our faith and we're not going to betray Jesus. And then immediately, some soldier of the anti-Christian regime finds us just sitting in our car, and he's like, "Hey, like, what are you guys doing out here? You Christian by chance?" And then we're kind of shocked because we're like, "Wow, this is crazy. Like, our faith is really being put to the test." And then my sister, of all people, extremely nonchalantly just raised her hand, got up, and said, like, "Oh yeah, we're Christian." Like, there was no fear in her eyes whatsoever, even though I think she understood the consequences. And then they pulled us aside and they said, like, "Oh well, that's not acceptable." And they brought out this like big wheel of death where they spun the wheel, and whatever it landed on would be like the mode with which they would kill us. But they took us all one at a time. And I remember my when they pulled out me and they spun the wheel of death, and it said like it landed on something that said like intolerable, painful death, just like the worst death you could imagine. And then I was thinking like, oh, that sounds like it sucks. I don't really want to face an intolerably painful death. But then all of a sudden, my brother, again, kind of like how my sister was very nonchalant, just extremely casually stepped up and said like, "Oh yeah, like I'll take it. Like don't worry." And then there was something about his willingness to do it so easily that made me think like, "Oh no, like I should probably have courage myself." And then I said like, "No, I'll take it. Don't worry." And then at first, as they were coming at me, the persecutors, I was trying to fight them off. But then they kind of looked at me and said, like, "You're not going to fight us off. You might as well just give in." And I was still hesitant. And then I remember one of them looked at me, and the exact quote that he said in my dream was, "If you truly believe your kingdom is not of this world, then you should have no fear in facing your death." And then I kind of thought, like, you know what? You're right. And then he came at me with like these big scissors. Like, you know, when you're cutting your lawn and you have like massive scissors.
You're
And he
cutting
started,
like a bush, not you,
yeah,
not
you're cutting like a bush. You're cutting like a
like
bush. He came
yeah.
at me with those. And then he just knocked me down to the ground. And then he started opening up, like splitting open my intestines. And he was kind of like
Oh,
playing
look at
around
the
with the small
details.
intestine, like there were a bunch of like it was
Okay.
spaghetti that he was cutting up. And I was just sitting there alive. He was like pulling up my intestines and just cutting them up. First, it was really it sucked. But then I kind of had like an internal voice say to me like, "No, don't worry. Like this is nothing that this is no worse than anything Jesus went through before you." And then I had that voice in my head, and then I was kind of like an inner, very inner calm washed over me as this guy was ripping up my intestines, and the whole and like my vision kind of faded into white, and I just like I said, just had like a very tranquil sense on the inside. And then I woke up, and that was the end of the dream. But there was something fascinating about that dream that kind of made me think like the Christian life is, in some sense, terrifying in what it demands, in that it demands us to offer literally everything we have, even to the point of death on a cross or death by getting your insides cut up by people who hate Christianity. But in another sense, it's also very comforting in that we understand as Christians that everything we're called to undergo, like as much as the world hates us, it hated Jesus first. And no matter how bad the suffering is that we may face, it's ultimately it ultimately connects us to the saving passion of Jesus and makes us more alive in a much deeper eternal sense than anything that the world has to offer. So, as terrifying as the cross is, it's also comforting knowing that the resurrection is right around the corner.
I would. I really don't have anything to say directly in response to that, but I suppose that that whole spiel kind of speaks for itself. Um, one thing that I do want to say is that I don't want this to seem as though what we are doing here is merely trying to disprove the rational atheist position and prove the position that we've aligned ourselves with, because I think we then not only do we lose some credibility, but I think the debate itself loses credibility, as if we were debating between two theories about how grass grows, let's say. But like I I suppose that the reason that, or at least I hope that the reason that we are casting skepticism on the atheistic position is not necessarily because we have an ardent desire to disprove it for the sake of disproving it, but because there really does seem to be some real validity to the other perspective, that there is something higher towards which we feel drawn, and towards which, if we strive, then good things happen, dare I say. Um,
Even if those good things end in a very painful death, as ironic as that may be.
yeah, I feel like I'm searching for a conclusion that I can't exactly grasp. I don't know if you have anything else to add, but
I guess the last thing I'll add is I guess the last thing I'll add would just be a question for all viewers, whether disciple or doubter, to ponder is like is it possible to be is it possible to be truly free if you don't first face the cross? Like, is it possible to be truly free if you don't first encounter some sort of very difficult suffering, if that makes sense? And I think if you could answer, however you answer that question, will probably give you a good sense of what you believe, whether or not you could be. It will probably give you a good sense of what God you ultimately serve, I think.
I think to follow up on that briefly, um, I think that we oftentimes, well, we want to be right, and so because it's that's a part of our nature, and so we desire for the way that we are living to be the proper way of living, and I think we often feel uh, that our ego has taken a hit when someone challenges the notion that uh, the way that we are living is in fact the ideal way of living. So, an atheist listening to this, if we have any atheist listeners, I'm not sure, might have heard what you just said, heard the question you just posed, and think, well, I'm doing fine, and I'm happy with the way my life is going, and I'm not seeking out suffering every moment of every day, and uh, I'm not seeking out God every moment of every day, but like it's, things are going pretty well, uh, and like fine. But should we not all ask ourselves on a frequent basis, is the way that I'm living truly the best way that I could be living? I mean, are we really okay to stop asking that question and just be content with our lives as they are? I think that if you are to live a truly full life, then it's important to continue asking yourself that question. Am I doing the best that I could be doing? And I suppose that the conclusion that you've reached in this episode is that um, if you haven't yet arrived on Jesus, if you haven't yet arrived on suffering for the sake of salvation, then you aren't doing the best that you could be doing. If that's true, I don't know, but it's certainly a compelling idea.
It's something worth considering for sure. So I think we'll end on that.
We shall.
We'll give you all that idea to consider.
All right.
All right. Thank
Talk
you all
to you
for
guys, right?
listening. I'll keep you all in my prayers, all of you, you millions of listeners.
One day.
All right. So long.
Peace out. God bless.